Hey, welcome back to the Healthy Living Scottsdale podcast. I'm your host, Coach Zach, and I am here with the lovely Coach Brandy. And today we are talking about type 3 diabetes. That's right. You probably never heard of that, type 3 diabetes. But before we do, we want to give a little shout out to a client of the week. And this week, Brandy has a pick, and I'm going to let her go ahead because I'm usually not here by the time this lady comes in to train. So, Brandy, this one's all you.
Yeah, so I wanted to throw it out to Elizabeth Lograva today. Elizabeth has been super consistent. I would say there's been a change in her consistency. She's been coming in frequently, really crushing her workouts, progressive overload. So she's been really working on, lifting heavier and increasing the weights and all of her different lifts. Her daughter recently joined. And so I really see her kind of acting as a role model for her daughter that's recently joined. And the two of them come in together and she's like showing her daughter giving her like technique tips and things that I've worked on with Elizabeth, and she's like sharing that information with her daughter, and then just really pushing it hard. And I've seen some great progress from Elizabeth in terms of, I can see some muscle definition that I didn't see before, and she's lifting heavier, she's consistent. And she's, sharing that with her daughter, which I think is awesome as well.
That's so cool. And one thing I know about Elizabeth is that I don't get to see her because she comes in at 6 p.m. I'm usually gone by then. But I know that she travels quite a bit for like long periods of time, right? So she'll be gone for like a month. And for a lot of people, that's enough to take them out of the routine where they completely fall off and they don't just jump back on the horse as soon as they get back in town. Right. And so I think that that's really cool when that just demonstrates to you like how much of a priority it is for her. Like you mentioned, being a role model, maybe that's the motivation there, and her health and, all of that. But there's obviously like some intrinsic motivation there to say like, hey, I'm going out of town. I got to travel. It's going to be like a rough month. And then as soon as I get back, I'm like right back on it. Right. So that's very cool.
Yeah. Great job, Elizabeth.
Yeah. Great job. Okay. Brandy, let's talk about type 3 diabetes, AKA Alzheimer's and dementia. Right. So I think it's interesting that they in other countries, they kind of have just stopped referring to like Alzheimer's and dementia. They just say, hey, it's type 3 diabetes, right? And really what diabetes is insulin resistance, right? And so what this is insulin resistance in the brain itself and the impact that has on your cognitive ability. And it seems as though it's not necessarily with like an Alzheimer's or dementia that, your memory is erased. It's just you have an inability to access the memory, right? And that could be, or most likely is caused by this inflammation inside the brain tissue, and especially with the synapses of your neurons, and then which impacts your ability to then connect the dots and recall a memory.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about this.
Sure.
I know you went down the rabbit hole. You said you went down the rabbit hole preparing for this.
Yeah, I've been, learning about type 3 diabetes, and I think there's a lot of emerging science around type 3 diabetes. I think it's not something that's very common term here in the United States. I think that's starting to change, but there is still a lot of emerging data around it. So like you said, type 3 diabetes is a type of Alzheimer's disease. So there can be a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's is a form of dementia that results in like plaques developing within the brain. So what happens with type 3 diabetes is this insulin resistance within the brain is not allowing the brain to utilize the glucose that's traveling through the bloodstream in the brain. So then there's this excess glucose within the bloodstream that in turn is forming these plaques and inflammation that's then impairing, cognition and memory and the ability to perform like daily, tasks that would normally be pretty easy because those plaques have developed and then it's impairing the brain function.
Yeah, and they refer to those as amyloid plaques, right? Which is basically just like damaged neurons or damaged cells, I guess, in the brain that then are creating kind of this plaque buildup. And like you said, that's kind of the, I guess, key indicator of Alzheimer's disease, right? There's this research. I think the kind of the journey or thing that led to the discovery of, hey, this is probably tied to insulin, is they noticed that people with type 1 and type 2, especially type 2 diabetes, had a much higher rate of Alzheimer's and dementia, right? And so you kind of start connecting the dots and linking things together, and you realize like, hey, there's insulin that's also produced in the brain, as well as the pancreas, and we're discovering like, hey, there's all this damage that's taking place to the tissue. And when we think about like somebody with type 2 diabetes and the damage that is done to, I mean, people with type 2 diabetes, severe cases are losing limbs all the time, right? Or digits or whatever. Yeah. It's not uncommon for somebody to have a toe cut off and then an ankle and then, half their leg and then their full leg until they eventually like die. And so it's not like that tissue damage is not isolated to like a leg, right? Or a limb. It's like that's taking place throughout the whole entire body. Right. And it's probably just like, hey, where is a weakness within your body? Oh, it's in the brain. Well, we're going to attack the brain tissue versus the leg tissue or this other type of body part, right? And so what we're seeing is the damage that's taking place is just happening in the brain for a certain group or population of people that develop this insulin resistance, and then they're ending up with Alzheimer's and diabetes.
And the data is pretty staggering. I've seen different like numbers out there, but I think generally the number that seems to be pretty consistent is about people that have diabetes, and specifically type 2 diabetes, are 50% more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease.
50%.
50%. Okay. And then if you look at people that have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, 80% of those people have also had type 2 diabetes or diabetes. So there's certainly a link there. So that's like the insulin resistant type of Alzheimer's disease. There's also, you can develop Alzheimer's from like if you have a stroke and then there's, damage to the brain as a result of that stroke that can then lead to Alzheimer's as well. But I think another thing that I thought was interesting was people that are pre-diabetic and people that maybe don't even realize they are pre-diabetic can also have, like if that goes untreated for a long period of time, can then in turn be an indicator for the future development of Alzheimer's because they're not treating the diabetes or the pre-diabetes through medication or lifestyle changes. And that's an exciting thing with this type 3 diabetes is that there are lifestyle changes that you can implement to help prevent the onset of Alzheimer's and diabetes if you address those things early on.
Yeah, and it's one thing that I know we kind of have mixed feelings about like GLP-1 drugs, but there is some promising research around how it impacts like insulin resistance and how those drugs are actually treating insulin resistance versus traditional diabetes drugs that are just impacting like blood glucose levels. And so there's actually, there's some promising research coming out about how this is actually going to positively impact insulin resistance, which could potentially lead to some breakthroughs in Alzheimer's and dementia as well. Now, Brandy, like my take on this is that it's like the cause of this is sugar, fake sugar,
Yes.
synthetic
Yeah,
sugars
yeah.
and sweeteners,
Processed
processed foods.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
That, I think that's really because, like, Alzheimer's and dementia it wasn't really like in existence. I don't want to say it wasn't in existence, but it wasn't as common as it is today, 50 years ago,
Right.
100 years ago,
Right.
Like, and especially early onset, right? Like, nobody's going to fault somebody that's 95 years old that has a little trouble remembering things, right? But you didn't have people that were in their 60s and 70s now, like, not being able to recall things and starting to lose it.
Yeah, the rates of Alzheimer's is growing and the rates of type 2 diabetes is growing. And, you know, we're clearly understanding that there's a link there between the two. And with type 2 diabetes, that's not something, whereas with type 1 diabetes, that's a condition that you're born with, an autoimmune disorder that you're born with. Your body's not able to properly produce, or the insulin that your body does produce doesn't work correctly. Type 2 diabetes is
self-inflicted.
Right. As a result of diet, lifestyle, obesity, as a result of eating processed foods, having too much glucose in your bloodstream, and then that in turn causes the insulin hormone to be overproduced and then becomes resistant within the body and then is no longer doing its job.
Yeah. And I think that type 2 diabetes has become so common that, and being pre-diabetic has become so common that there's not really as much fear around it as there should be, right? Because people are like, well, I can take a drug, I'll just be on metformin and I can live with this, right? However, getting Alzheimer's or dementia, or having somebody close to me in my life develop that, and having to be on the other end taking care of that person terrifies me, right? Like, in terms of like my greatest fears, I would put that close to the top.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that for somebody listening to this, what I want to do is, like, you can't control everything, but you can control a lot of things. Like, what should people be doing right now to but to control what they can control and do everything they can possible to make sure this doesn't happen to them?
Yeah, so several things that people can do. One, nutrition. So you need to tackle this through nutrition and get really serious about what you're consuming. So making sure that you're not eating processed foods, foods that are high in, processed sugars. I think there's a myth out there that fruits, because fruit have natural sugar, are bad for people that may have diabetes or developing diabetes. That is not the case. We're talking about processed sugars, like your table sugar, and processed foods, saturated fats. So going to a more whole food based diet where you're eating plenty of protein, plenty of fruits and vegetables, and then healthy fats, avocados, nuts, seeds, things like that. And then cutting out processed foods. So that's number one, getting your weight under control, and exercise. Exercise is so important. Exercise is the stimulus that tells your body to, for that insulin to transform that glucose in your bloodstream into energy. So exercise is important, diet, sleep, managing stress, all of those things.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the diet piece, because I think that the major concern is the sugar intake, right? Like, Americans' sugar intake has increased by over 400% in the last 40 years, right? And so we're so far above the recommended daily allowance for sugar, and it's killing us. I mean, it really is killing us. I think the majority of the problems that we have could could be traced back to our sugar intake, especially, and the synthetic sugars, right? Like your aspartames and your high fructose corn syrup, or just corn syrup, and all of those things. And a lot of them are not even designed around taste, right? They're designed in a lab to create a dopamine response. So by nature, they're actually, these evil people in these labs were like, hey, let's make this more addictive and we'll make more money by people consuming it, not, being concerned with human beings and all the disease and everything that's going to contribute to. But for like our listeners, it's like, stop the sugar intake and stop the synthetic sugars. And so if you have like a diet soda, it's 0 calories and 0 sugar, it's like, that is probably worse for you than eating like 5 tablespoons of sugar. Like, you would be better off doing that. So don't fool yourself into thinking that that's something that's I'm making a healthier choice. You're not making a healthier choice. You're actually making a worse decision that is just going to make you more addicted to sugar. It's desensitizing your ability to taste sweet, which means you're going to then have to have more sweetness in order to crave or curb that craving. And it's just like the absolute worst cycle you could go down, right?
Yeah.
We're really killing ourselves at the end of the day, right? The sugar intake, the processed foods, the stress, the not getting enough sleep, like all of those things, just healthy lifestyle things, not working out. All of those things are your tools to ward off disease and enjoy life and just feel really good while you're living it.
Right. I mean, I think that's the takeaway, is there's something that you can do about it, and like, start today, because if not today, when? And the longer you wait, the more this, your
risk,
you're impacting your body. The risk is going to increase over time if you don't do something about it now. So take action.
All right, guys, that's all we got today. We'll be back next week with more great stuff. Thank you so much for listening to the Healthy Living Scottsdale podcast. Do you have a question that you'd like for us to answer live on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to the Apple Podcast app on your iPhone and do 3 simple things. First, leave us a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. In that review, ask anything you want related to health, fitness, or nutrition. And if you want a shout out, leave us your Instagram handle or name. That's all you have to do. Then listen to hear your questions answered live on the next Q&A episode.